So when I was a kid, I loved stories of good overcoming evil. I remember I had this big fairy tale book, like all sorts of stories that I would just kind of pour over again and again of, cruel and wicked tyrants and wicked witches being overthrown by clever peasants and courageous knights. I got into superheroes, which is basically just a modern fairy tale, right? Of people with magical powers like Spider-Man or Superman beating the bad guys. I love stories of evil being overcome by good. And it wasn't just that I liked reading those stories, I wanted to be a part of that story. I remember almost as early as I was able to start writing, I would put pen to paper and write stories about Super Geoff. And sometimes his classmates, Super Adam and Super Aaron, flying around and beating all the the evil people. I don't think I'm actually the only one who had this fascination as a kid with good overcoming evil. It's interesting to me. We seem to keep on telling the same stories over and over and over again, whether it's Westerns, the bad guys and the good guys, the white hats and the black hats, or Marvel Cinematic Universe, or Star Wars. Again and again, what is it but good overcoming evil? And I wonder if it's because there's something just deep within us, this awareness that things are not right, that things are bad, and this longing to see good win. When I was growing up, it seemed to me that our nation kind of had a shared sense of good overcoming evil. Evil was the Soviet Union. I mean, think about Red Dawn or Rambo or Hunt for Red October. America was the good guys standing up for things like freedom and justice and McDonald's, and the Soviet Union was everything against that, and we were going to win, good triumphing over evil. But when the fall of the Berlin Wall came, I think that kind of changed for a while, where it started seeming like the idea of evil was primitive, medieval, right? That like people aren't evil, they're confused. They're ignorant, they're sick, they're maladjusted. And so correspondingly, the more grown-up stories no longer had that kind of clear black and white, good versus evil. There were stories, the kind of ones that Nick Owens likes. The ones where the hero is flawed and the bad guys are understandable and it's all gray. But I think that's beginning to change. I think we're once again beginning, the idea of evil is coming back in fashion, if you will. Whether it's different issues like Me Too, or abortion, or George Floyd, or school shootings. These are things that people don't just want to say, well, that was a mistake, or that was unwise or unpleasant. No, when we look at what is really happening in those kinds of events, we recoil and we say, that's evil. Both on the right and on the left, there seems to be agreement. Evil is real. But what do we do about it? There are some who would say, I don't think there's anything we can do. In a recent survey, when Gen Z people were, the members of the Gen Z generation were asked, a majority agreed with the statement that when they look at the world, they see the problems are too great, there's nothing that can be done about it. Fairy tales are fairy tales. Superheroes aren't real. We can't fix this. There are others who, instead of responding with kind of hopelessness, respond with kind of the fight instinct. Things are bad, and they're so bad that we need to do whatever it takes to be able to overcome evil, even if that means getting our hands a little bit dirty. So from the left, we hear stories of cancel culture, the idea that First Amendment is good up to a point, but sometimes we just have to shout down certain opinions because they are so bad and we have to fight evil, and if we have to do something's wrong to get there, we will. It's not just the left, though. I've heard more and more people kind of more on the conservative right saying that things like abortion are so bad that we need to use whatever means necessary. So there's one Christian political scientist who recently wrote that Christians must necessarily employ crudeness, subterfuge, and even deception to defy the enemies of God and wage war against evil. We need, if it takes that, to lie, cheat, and steal so that we can win. What do we do about evil? Well, hopefully, as you are listening to the passage that was just read, you might have heard a different way us being invited to. We've been looking at Romans 12 in the last few weeks, where Paul is painting a vision of what we as the redeemed people of God are called to be. In Romans, we see that when we place our faith in Jesus, not only are we rescued in such a way where we are brought to God, but we are told we are brought in connection to each other. We're brought into this web of relationships where we're united and called to love each other. And that's what we've been looking at the last couple of weeks. But when we get to verse 13, Paul turns his gaze in describing what the church is supposed to be and talks about how we are to relate to the world around us. And as he talks about that, our calling in this world, he begins to talk about evil. Did you notice it's the very last verse of the passage that was just read, where we read, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Yes, Paul says, evil is real. Yes, evil can be overcome. And yes, you and I are supposed to be involved in this work. For all of you who, like me, had this desire as a kid to somehow be part of the good guys, beating the bad guys, that's actually what we're supposed to do. This is part of the calling of the church. We as a church are meant to participate in God's work of overcoming evil with good. That is our calling. And Paul tells us, and here's how you do it. We see these two instructions. First, do not be overcome by evil. Perhaps when we first hear that, we might hear those words kind of as part of the culture war. Don't let the bad guys win. But if we look actually at this passage more closely, we'll realize that Paul's not really talking about them. When he's saying do not be overcome by evil, he's talking about us. So perhaps the clearest example of that is when he says in verse 17, repay no one evil for evil. What does it look like to be overcome by evil? It's to, in the process, become evil ourselves. When we are wronged, to seek to retaliate in such a way where we ourselves join in with evil. One of the most horrific things that I can think of that's happened during my lifetime is the genocide in Rwanda. Some of you might be familiar, where the Hutus, in the span of a few months, killed over 500,000 Tutsis. It's numbers that my mind cannot fathom. And if you're at all aware of what happened in Rwanda in this genocide, you might know the story behind it, that for decades leading up to that, the Tutsis, the one who ended up, many of them were killed, were the wrongdoers. They were the ones in positions of powers. They were the ones who were wronging the Hutus again and again with forms of racism and forms of oppression. So the Hutus had a point. They were wronged, but what do? They respond to evil with an even greater evil. In their response, they're overcome by evil, and in their end, the only thing that wins is evil itself. It seems to me that one of the ways that Satan traps us is he gives us a tunnel vision. If we're not careful, we can zero in on a particular issue that seems all-defining, or a particular political race, or a particular person who's an enemy. And if that is all that it is, that we just need to overcome that person, well, we can do what it takes. We can employ what is sometimes even described as a necessary evil to be able to win. But the reality is we're not trying to just win in that one issue. What we really want to do is to overcome evil itself. And whenever we employ lying, deceit, cruelty to be able to overcome evil, well, in the end, evil is all that actually wins. I don't know if there's anyone who more articulately put it in this than Martin Luther King, who, as he was inviting people to respond, those who were deep victims of racism, here's what he said. He said, "The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie nor establish the truth. Through violence, you may murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." I've heard Christians talking about our political calling, saying sometimes to be able to wrestle a pig, you have to get a little dirty. And I want to suggest that we're called to something better than that. Our desire is not just to win in the moment. Our calling is to overcome evil, to disarm evil itself. And to do that, we don't overcome evil with evil. We overcome evil with good. That, of course, is the second instruction that we see at the end of our passage. And if we look at our passage, we see Paul's vision for what that means, to overcome evil with good. He is calling us to a radical hospitality of love. So verse 13 is where Paul kind of changes the topic. Up until verse 13 in our passage, the stuff that we looked at last week, he is very much focusing on how we are to relate to each other. But then at the end of verse 13, notice what he says. He says, seek to show or pursue hospitality. Hospitality in Greek literally is just the love of the outsider. Pursue the love of the outsider. And then he tells us what that looks like. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. It's easy to miss the connection between those two statements, but in the Greek you see it more clearly because literally it's pursue, love of the outsider, bless those who pursue you. It's the same word. In other words, when we're talking about the outsider in this context, it's not just someone who's kind of, they don't know much about church, they're kind of unfamiliar with things, we should kind of make them feel okay. The outsider in this context very well could be the one who considers you their enemy. It very well could be the one that Paul is saying, love and welcome the outsider, treat them as friend. He's talking about those who are persecuting. Saying, how do you respond when evil is done to you, when the threat of evil lies over you? Treat your enemies like friends. This is a matter of both attitude and action. So attitude we see immediately thereafter in the following verses. When it comes to outsiders, one of the chief dangers I think we have, what's sometimes described as tribalism, is to think of those outside of our community as somehow less than, as somehow other. And I wish we could say that the church is not guilty of that, but we see examples all the time of the church doing exactly that. So in the 80s, when the AIDS crisis first kind of became more public, there were Christian political action groups that spoke against the government doing any sort of research for how to address AIDS, seeing it as judgment upon the gay community. Let them figure it out themselves. Horrific. Or I would say it's not uncommon to hear when churches are exposed to the plight of the poor to say, well, there's some irresponsibility. That's drugs. There's bad choices being made. It's their fault. To kind of to leave people at a distance. But notice how different what Paul calls us to with the attitude he invites us to. The attitude we see in the following verse, after verse 14, when he says, "Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep." Often this is interpreted as suddenly Paul is changing his topic. He was talking about persecutors. Now he's going back to talking about caring for the church. But the context is pretty clear that he's talking about when we look at the outsider and treat them as friends, that involves rejoicing with those who are rejoicing and mourning with those who are mourning. We're in a world that is aching and in anguish. And while we might be tempted to say, well, that's their fault, that is not our calling. Our calling is to move towards them in care. The next verse tells us what we should be avoiding. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. While our temptation might be to say, those people over there, the calling is to join with them and feel the weight and the burden of other people's sufferings as our own, because this is how you treat friends. And our calling is to treat outsiders, even if they think that they are our enemies, as friends. But of course, it moves beyond just attitude, and it moves to action. So, verse 17, repay no one evil for evil. We've already seen that. But give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. And that word honorable could just as easily, or probably better, be translated what is good or what is beautiful. In the sight of all. That means not just amongst us, but amongst our entire community, which is crazy when you start imagining what he's saying. When he's saying, say you have people who are trying to shut your church down. Maybe they're trying to kick you out of the building. What you need to do is have a brainstorming session of what is something we can do that is undeniably kind to them, because our calling is to treat them as friends. Or verse 18, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Again, that all is important. We're not just talking about living peaceably within the church, we're talking about in the community around us. There's a really important qualifier here when it says, if possible, so far as it depends on you. There will be times where it's not possible. There will be times when our faithfulness to Jesus means we are going to say and do things that are considered offensive and considered out of accord with what society expects. But what it also says is, so far as it depends on you, bend over backwards to live in harmony with the surrounding community. When you see what's going on, seek to support, seek to encourage, seek to live at peace with the community around us, because that's how you treat friends. And though they might think of themselves as your enemy, you will treat these outsiders as friends. I know of churches for whom it's kind of a badge of honor that people don't like them. They hated Jesus. They killed Jesus. If they hate us, that's a sign we're doing something right. And to be clear, there will be times that what we do because of Jesus will be offensive. But the expectation that we see in places like 1 Peter and elsewhere is that we are to live such good lives before others that even though they think we're weird and sometimes frustrating, they also say, I gotta hand it to them. They're also really kind. I contrast that attitude with what you hear in the early church. There's one of my favorite little documents that we have from is a guy by the name of Emperor Julian, who was someone who really wanted to stop the spread of Christianity, and he's writing it to a priest, and you can sense his frustration when he's saying, I don't know what to do. They don't just take care of their own poor, they take care of ours as well. How do you compete with that? That's what we're talking about here. If we want to see kind of like a picture of the actions of hospitality, in some ways the image that encapsulated all this where he goes near the very end, rather than responding in vengeance towards those who are cruel, to the contrary, verse 20 it says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. If you want to have an image of what it looks like for good to overcome evil, get Superman out of your head. It probably wasn't in your head, but it was in mine. Get whatever other story might be out of your head, like Westerns. Here is the picture that we are invited to consider. This is what the battle looks like. If someone is bad-mouthing your church or bad-mouthing Christianity, take him out to lunch or invite him in your home. Ask how he's doing. Seek to pray for him. Does that sound like wildly idealistic, even naive, that this is how evil is overcome? Perhaps if we're thinking of just the moment, it seems that way. Perhaps we're thinking, well, if we kind of do that, we know that people will play dirty. We know that they'll get power. We know that they'll be able to get their way. But remember, the goal is not in the moment to beat them. The goal is for all of the world to overcome evil itself. And the only way that anyone can overcome evil truly is with good. Notice what Paul goes on to say in verse 20. When we do this, for by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Now, what does that mean? Well, let me try to illustrate. Imagine you are in the grocery store with a young kid or two. If you're a parent of young children, imagine it's yours. If not, maybe you're babysitting or it's a grandchild or a nephew or niece. And they're just being awful. I mean, awful. I mean, grocery store bad can be really bad if you've ever experienced it before. And they're trying to pull everything off the shelves, and they're nagging, and they're asking when you're done. And at a certain point, you just lose it, and you tell them to stop being so terrible. And then you look past the kids, and you see some friends that you really actually want to like you and think highly of you. What are you feeling in that moment? Well, yes, embarrassed, but how is your face feeling? It's feeling hot. You feel like this shame. You're feeling, you might say, burning coals being placed upon you in that moment. That's the image that's being talked about, although it's talking about something different. Let's try a different illustration. Imagine you are once again, we're angry. Anger seems to be a good place for our illustrations. And you're really frustrated. Maybe it's with a friend or family member, and you've just been really grumpy. And so when you see the person, you just kind of let them have it, and you complain about something they did. And you're just fully expecting for them to yell right back at you, because that's kind of the way it's supposed to be. But instead, they pause, and they say, yeah, that's fair. I'm really sorry. And it looks like things aren't going very well for you right now. How are you doing? What do you feel in that moment when you're expecting something different from that? At least for me, when something like that happens, it catches me off guard. And honestly, I start feeling embarrassed because I see the way that I was. My face maybe feels hot. Burning coals are being placed upon my head. And in that moment, when I am responding hopefully wisely, and I don't always do so, I bring my temperature down a few notches and apologize and say, hey, you know what? That was out of line too. And when that happens, what's just happened? Good has overcome evil. Of course, we know that's not always how it works. Sometimes when people respond to good, they just shut it down, they shut their hearts and just keep in the direction they're going. But sometimes that's what happens. When we seek to love and treat outsiders as friends, even if they see themselves as against us, we are heaping burning coals upon their head. And in this, God can work through this to overcome evil with good. And that is how we as a church are called to battle. Now, let me ask one more final time, does this feel thoroughly unrealistic? Are you thinking right now, okay, that sounds great up front, but it is not going to work. Let me give you 3 reasons why you're wrong. The first reason, as we conclude, is that, all 3 reasons have one basic idea, and that is what we are doing is not alone, but we are part of something bigger. The first reason why we can be confident that doing this, as small and as weak as it feels, is part of the truly effective overcoming of evil, is that we know that God has promised to make all things right. One of the real challenges, one of the immediate, but wait a second questions that we might be asking when we're hearing that this is our calling is, but wait a second, what happens when we have been truly and deeply wronged? Are you saying that we're supposed to just treat it as nothing? And to be clear, what we're not saying is that we're supposed to kind of get rid of all righteous means. It is right for us to expose evil when evil is done. When someone has broken the law, it is right for us to call the police and bring the authorities in. But you and I both know that there are times when even we've done everything right and even still, wrongs go unaddressed and injustices remain. And there is a part of us that wants to hold on until we have made things right ourselves. And notice what we're told in verse 19. Verse 19, it doesn't say, it is wrong for you to want that. It is wrong for you to desire that vengeance takes place. It is wrong for you to desire that what is wrong be made right. No, that's not what's said. What does it say? Don't avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Do you realize that God's wrath is actually good news? If you have been wronged and you know the wrongdoer still goes unexposed, God's saying, I will repay. You do not have to carry this. You do not have to carry the longing for what is wrong to be made right. I will carry it and I will make it right. This wrong will be exposed, and either it will be made right by this person being led to repentance and clinging to the blood of Christ Jesus, or this wrong will be made right by this wrongdoer being punished. But either way, you don't have to carry this. You can choose simply to love the one who has wronged you, knowing that I will be the one who makes things right. Evil can be overcome by good because we know God promises to make things right. And what's more, we can be confident that this is something that is possible because we are not alone. This might sound like, yes, I love the idea, this kind of almost Mr. Rogers vision of just showing kindness to people who are mean. But do you know me? This is not something I can do. I want to tell you, you're wrong. If you were talking just you by yourself, sure, that's right. All of us have this innate selfishness and self-protectiveness. But do you realize that the moment you've trusted in Jesus, you have become connected with him, and his Spirit dwells in you? And here's the thing. When Paul is saying these things in this passage, he's just riffing on what Jesus said. I mean, do you remember Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, bless your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Paul's just talking about that here. And Jesus didn't just say it. He lived this. His whole life was treating outsiders who he knew would reject him as friends, drawing near to them, grieving with those who grieve, rejoicing with those who rejoice, associating with the lowly, giving himself completely in kindness to those who would kill him. And he is the one who says, I am with you. Yes, you cannot love those who wrong you, not on your own, but you in Christ Jesus have a power that you do not realize, the Spirit as work in you. We as a church can do what we otherwise could not because Christ is with us. And third, and by far the most important point I think to make in this, is we can be confident that this is the way that evil will be overcome, because this is the way that evil already has been overcome. In the battle between good and evil, and this is something that Mackenzie said at the very beginning, we're not kind of in this tug of war where it could go either direction. We're at the stage where evil has already been decisively conquered. When Jesus went to the cross, when he died, it says that Satan was disarmed. He was cast down. Satan has lost. Evil has lost. And how? Through Jesus giving himself in the supreme act of goodness, giving his life for us. Goodness overcame evil. And wherever the gospel is preached, news of Jesus' victory is spread. We see that happening again and again and again. Let me ask you, what is it that changes you? What is it that has led you from darkness to light? What is it that leads you from selfishness to love? Is it fear? Is it, I don't want to do that again? No, it's more than that. What has dethroned the evil in your heart is the knowledge that the God of the universe is your Father, and he says, welcome home. I have forgiven you, I've loved you, and I give myself to you. His good overcomes our evil. And throughout our lives, as we are changed, we are only seeking to follow in the footsteps of what has already happened, taking hold of part of the mop-up duties as we are seeking to live out that victory in our lives in the way that we relate to the world. We can know that what we are doing is not small, is not in vain, that evil will be overcome by good because it already has been. On the last day, we will see it in its fullness. Paul's instructions to the church, to you, to me, are clear. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And we are invited even now to take a step in that direction. Every time that we come to God in confession and name our sin, and do so before a God who loves us and forgives us, we are allowing the goodness and love of God to once again disarm and dethrone the evil in our hearts. And so I invite us to take a couple minutes now to bring our sin before God and let his forgiveness change us. In a couple minutes' time, I will lead us in silent prayer and lead us in prayer.